Beloved, good evening. It is by God's grace and mercy that we are here and we find ourselves here at this midweek point of Wednesday night, a recharge, a refuel for those of us that life tends to do what life does, but God is still good anyway. And so we're thankful that we have another opportunity to assemble amongst each other just to encourage one another at the midweek point. Whether you're joining us in person or virtually, we want to welcome you to the South Central Church of Christ. And if you're in our cyber sanctuary, we want to welcome you. And if you have any questions, we ask that you submit those in the comment box and we will be sure to respond. And so it is so good to see those of you that are here with us in person. We are just still on a high, if you would, from worship on Sunday. And even looking back a week prior to our Black History program and celebrating the powerful talent that we have in our presence, in our midst, those that committed themselves to the work of rendering the Raisin in the Sun play for us. And so we're just thankful for them, for their contributions, and we are just continuing to celebrate in that. And so we fast forward to March, where we are in the process of celebrating Women's History Month. For those that may not know what that is, we ought to celebrate women more than just a month, but it's good anyhow that we have a month dedicated to the celebration of women. It is not anything in this world, dare I say, that would operate without the presence of women. All of us are here by the grace of God, obviously, but we came through women. And so it's our mothers that have, played pivotal roles in just our uprooting, our rearing. And so we're thankful for the contributions women make, but we also acknowledge that there's still a ways to go of women being treated as equals, as they should. And so tonight's study, I'm excited about. I'm excited because in the midst of Women's History Month, I wanted to look at a particular text that it's a strange text, but I think we'll find the blessing in it. In this text that we'll uncover, we'll find not only God's promise reigning true, but we'll also find God's grace and how that even through an enslaved woman, God is always good, and God's grace is sufficient. And when He makes a promise, His promise is everlasting, and He's going to follow up on that promise. And so I'm glad to be with you all this evening, and I pray that this is encouraging to all of us. God, we thank you for this moment. We thank you for this day. God, we just love you so much, and we thank you for the privilege of being in relationship with you, God. Thank you for the privilege of knowing who you are and having access to you through the avenue of your Son. God, we thank you for the sacrifice of your Son and what he means to his bride, the church. And God, we just thank you for this moment that we're able to study and be able to make sure that you get the glory in all that we do. God, we love you, we thank you, and we ask that you be with us all the days of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Beloved, if you would, this afternoon, this evening rather, I went through all three, right? So y'all can tell what time it is, morning, afternoon, evening, somewhere in there. This evening, if you will meet me in the book of Genesis chapter 16. And it's a longer text this evening, but this is Bible study. So this is when we dig into the pages. Genesis 16, verses 1 through 16. And that should set the stage for where we're going this evening. Genesis 16, verses 1 through 16. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible. And it reads like this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him a child, but she had an Egyptian slave woman whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please have relations with my slave woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Then he had relations with Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar became aware that she had conceived, her mistress was insignificant in her sight. So Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I put my slave woman into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was insignificant in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Look, your slave woman is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarai's slave woman, from where have you come, and where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." So the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her further, "Behold, you are pregnant and will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. But he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live in defiance of all his brothers." Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees me." For she said, "Have I even seen him here and lived after he saw me?" Therefore the well was called Bir-lahai-roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore a son to Abram, and Abram named his son to whom Hagar gave birth Ishmael. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to her. A word from God for the people of God. In Genesis 16, we see a familiar text in that it involves Abraham, who we know is affectionately referred to as the father of all nations. And he became the father of all nations not at this point. We all know the background of, if you go a few chapters prior, it was the angel of the Lord that came to Sarai before her name was Sarah, when she was Sarai, and told her that she would give birth to a son. She was 75. She was 70 when she got this particular dream. This word, but it did not come to pass right away. And so in her patience, if you would, or her lack of patience, she becomes frustrated in her inability. And in this inability, she struggles with this idea that she's not able to give Abram a child. But she wrestles with this idea that she knows she's received this promise. But as time goes on, she realizes that I'm getting older. I'm getting older, and more of my years are probably behind me than ahead of me. But in spite of it, I have this promise. And so she wrestles with this idea of whether or not God still is going to make good on this promise. And so she comes up with this idea of her own with one of her enslaved women. Now, before we get into the focal point of the text of what exactly uh, the role she played in this and God's hand in this entire situation, what does this have to do with Women's History Month? Well, as I mentioned, this is a month we celebrate women and their accomplishments, what it is that they've done, and where we still have to go. It's no secret that although women deserve most of the credit for a lot of things, and there are a lot of things, a lot of inventions, and a lot of processes and creations that we would not have had it not been for women. And in spite of all of this, we still don't give the proper respect at times or the proper due that belongs to women for their contributions. In fact, it's just a fact that women make up over 75% of most churches. And so, quite naturally, in women making up 75% of most churches, uh, most women, or the majority of women, are the ones who finance and are the reason that churches exist in a lot of ways, because they are the majority. So not only are they the majority, and they contribute in so many ways, not only from a support level, but financially, they contribute so many ways to the church, and yet uh, their roles continue to be diminished. And in some places, they don't have roles. I know someone personally that um, they have. They talk about how special their wife is, how talented she is. She has these different gifts and these abilities of what she can do, and I've seen these things on display. But yet, when it comes to her role in worship or her role at church, um, the role she plays at the church that they attend, he believes that she ought not have a place, or she doesn't play a significant role in church, and that he's okay with her being in a diminished light or in a diminished capacity at church. And that's hard for me to kind of wrestle with, because out of one breath you acknowledge that someone has all of these gifts and talents, and in another breath you want to suppress those talents and you don't want them on display. But if you could just imagine the gifts that she could give to the kingdom, if we just got out of our own way of some of the short-sightedness that we have, sometimes as brethren and sometimes with tradition. There are women that do the same roles as men in the workplace. They've been there sometimes twice as long. They know twice as much at times. And in fact, it's not uncommon that when their male counterparts are hired, that they do a majority or a good deal of the training, only for them to later find out that the male was brought in at a higher salary. And so she's wrestling with this idea that not only was I good enough to train this person, not only was I good enough initially to do the work prior to this person coming in, but now that I've done all of these things, you think that this person, I'm not worthy of being compensated on the same level as this person. And so women are unfairly paid as it relates to the proportion of what men are getting paid in the workplace. Women are not promoted as fast as men are in the workplace. It's just a fact that in the workplace, you'll find that males are promoted sometimes 2 and 3 times faster than women are that do the same work. And as I mentioned, they've been in some of the roles a lot longer. And so it's no secret that there's a complex that we have, and there's something wrong in society when women can birth our children and they can raise our families and they can tend to our households and they can encourage and build us up and they can do all of these things, and yet we still want to diminish their roles, or we don't want to acknowledge that they're just as significant in what they do as men. And so this aspect of Women's History Month, it's important because not only does it celebrate the accomplishments of women, but it also should highlight the way the distance that we still have to go and the work that still needs to be done to make things more equivalent in the world and more equitable. And so women also find themselves having to wrestle with something that men don't. When they have to make a tough decision between whether or not they want to expand their family or continue to be career driven, women have to decide whether or not they want to have children, because you know they have to, as time gets closer to the delivery, they have to take maternity leave. And oftentimes, as heinous as it is, and as unethical as it is and disgraceful, because these things are taken into consideration, that a woman may have to be out on maternity leave, they're sometimes looked over for these positions because they'll have to be out for a significant amount of time. But male counterparts don't have to deal with these issues. They can conceive with their wives, and they still can be all about work. They can be all the way in, and they don't have to miss a beat. In fact, it wasn't until around the time, maybe a little before I had my son, that I even heard of paternity leave. And most men, that wasn't something that their companies offer, but now we're seeing it more. But men never had to do these things to take this kind of time off, and they've never had to make the tough decision of whether I want to be about my career or whether my family comes first. And so when we look at those decisions that women have to wrestle with that men don't, um, we've got a long way to go, because those types of matters shouldn't be taken into consideration as it relates to their career or desire to have a career. They shouldn't have to make those types of decisions. And so, in looking at this text, we see that in light of the fact that women sometimes are forgotten about or placed on the back burner, or sometimes discredited, we see in Genesis 16 here, we see another woman that has also been overlooked and discredited, and not looked upon as an equal. And her name is Hagar. And what's interesting about Hagar, the text tells us at the beginning that this is an Egyptian slave woman. So we know that by her birthright and by her nationality, that she is a woman of color. She's a woman that not only is a woman, but she's got two stripes against her. She's a woman, and she's a woman of color. So she has these two stripes that she can't do anything about, that she was born with. And yet, in spite of it, she has to bear the burden of what comes with these two stripes, of her being a woman and a woman of color. And in the text, she is the slave woman to Sarai. And we know that Sarai is the wife of Abram. He's not yet the father of many nations, where his name is changed and the conversion is made to him being Abraham. So this is prior to that point, but God had blessed Abram and Sarai in all that they did, and they acquired land and territory, and in all that Abraham, in every path that his foot tread, God blessed him. God made sure that not only did he acquire land and did he acquire respect and power, but he also acquired resources. He was financially well. God made sure that he had cattle, and he had men and women that worked to tend to their affairs to make sure that they had everything that they needed. And so, in doing so, one of the people that is in the one of the women that is in the possession of Sarai is Hagar. And with her being in her possession, now we find Sarai in this situation where she is down on this belief that God has given her through an angel many years prior of her being able to conceive. And so now she's getting in the way where she's starting to believe that God is not going to necessarily make good on what it is that he said. And so she decides on her own that, I'm going to take matters into my own hands. And in me taking matters into my own hands, she's doing this through human means instead of relying on God's promise. So she figures that I can use Hagar to be the surrogate And in her being a surrogate to my child, she will make me a mother and Abram a father. And then maybe that promise is to come through her. She gets in her mind that maybe what God meant is that by her being in my possession as one of my slaves, that in this process, maybe this is what God meant when he said that this was going to be my child. So I'm going to come up with the plan for her to become one of Abram's wives. Now, in ancient culture, it's it's something for us to highlight and look at, that at this time women could give their maids to their husbands, and this would still be considered the um the owner's child. So in her conceiving, and we know that's a little different than technically our culture would dictate today. Typically with surrogates, oftentimes we'll see that women will, provide their egg to the surrogate, and the child naturally has the characteristics and the features and the DNA of the mother. But in this time period, by the fact that she was in the possession of Sarai, this became her child if she was to conceive with Abram. And so by her becoming one of the wives of Abram, this child that they had, this became hers. And so she decides that she's going to come up with this plan that if I can get Abram to take Hagar as a wife and he conceives with her, that maybe I could give him this child. And so this is almost kind of a plan, almost conjured to the extent of Adam and Eve, where Eve comes up with this plan for Adam, and Adam goes along with it. And so Abraham, also knowing and trusting God's promises, he goes along with this plan that Sarai comes up with. He goes along with it, and he says, you know what? If you'll allow this, then I'll go through with it. I will take this route of making her one of my wives, and I'll try to conceive with her. And so she ends up becoming one of his wives, and they end up conceiving. Now, what's interesting about this is that, in spite of, and this is the part that we'll get to at the end, but I'll introduce it now. Even in spite of when we go outside of God's promise, when we go outside of the will of God, God's grace always still finds a way to reign supreme in even our actions, even our missteps. When we get our feet into things that we should not be doing, God still finds a way in his glory with his grace to be sufficient. And we'll see that, because in spite of this not being the plan that God told them about, God said, I'm going to give you a child. So you were barren, but I'm going to give you a child. I didn't say that you would have to be a surrogate, but I'm going to give you a child. But even in spite of you going outside of my will, I'm still going to bless this child, and I'm going to bless you all in spite of your hands in this. And so that's what's interesting about this text as we go on. But in looking at chapter 16, we see that this story unfolds that, she ends up conceiving the child, and then there's this story that there's the part of the text where the two children are playing together. So Ishmael and Isaac are playing together, and Sarai becomes angry because she sees them playing together, and we don't quite know in the text why she gets angry, because it does not share with us why she becomes angry. But she becomes angry, and she said, but and many scholars will believe that she became angry because at this point she doubted whether or not Isaac was going to be the one that was blessed by by the promise, because now Ishmael's in the picture. So now she's doubting this. So as this story goes on, we see that in the text she tells Isaac that she tells Abram that she wants him to banish her from where they are. And so he does it. He doesn't like the idea, but he says, you know what? To keep harmony in the home, I'm going to go along with it. And God is going to bless her where she goes. But so that's how the chapter in this story completely unfolds. But I want us to look at chapter 21, because in chapter 21, a few chapters after, we'll see something interesting that he does. So this talks about after now this promise has taken place to where they actually conceive. Isaac. And so now Isaac is in the picture. And after Isaac is weaned, Sarah, she sees Hagar's son playing, and then she gets angry. So after she gets angry, we talked about he sends her away. This is when Hagar has fled. So she's now on the run because she doesn't know what's going on with her life, what's going to happen. And so she's on this journey. She's in the wilderness, and she runs out of resources. She's in a place that she doesn't know. She doesn't know when the next meal is going to come, when her next source of water is going to come. And she has this small child that is relying on her to take care of her. Now, it's interesting to point out that the text at the beginning never said anything about Hagar's response to conceiving with Abram. She was compelled into doing so because of her position as the enslaved woman to Sarai. But in spite of this, she gets what some would consider the short end of the stick. She gets banished. She gets exiled for something that she didn't even come up with. Sound familiar? How many times have we sometimes seen that there are things that oftentimes women get blamed for, and they have to reap they have to take the punishment, and they have to wear the burden of what it is somebody else did. And it's something that we don't often like to think about. You know, when a woman is a single parent and she doesn't have any support from the father, and she's struggling to make ends meet, and, you know, out of one breath, you know, she has to deal with the supervisor that doesn't understand that sometimes her child gets sick, and she doesn't have the luxury of relying on her husband or on a man to sometimes take the child and to be able to give her a break from to be able to focus on work. She always has to be the person to go to the school and get the child. And so now the supervisor, they're starting to become a problem at work, to where the supervisor is not understanding that she's the one that has to make these sacrifices all the time. She's not the only one that got herself in the situation, but she's forced to pick up the pieces and deal with the burden of the fallout of what happened from the situation. And we live in a society to where, unfortunately, for too long, women have had to wear this burden of having to not only be able to make sure that their child, that they're super mom, but to also be the breadwinner, and to also try to still be career driven, and to leave a little bit for herself at the end of the day. How many women have we met that, you know, when we ask them how they're doing, they give us they'll start off by saying, well, you know, I'm doing okay, I'm tired. You know, Jimmy has X, Y, and Z, and then, you know, once I get home, I've got to do blah, blah, blah. Nothing about herself. She wears so much of what she's responsible for, not only for her child, but for what she needs to even do for, you know, work and other family members. So much so that she leaves nothing for herself. And oftentimes, that's the story of many women, that they don't leave much for themselves. And when they look up, you know, you'll hear sometimes they'll say, well, man, you know, 10, 15, 20 years went by, and where did the time go? You know, I didn't leave anything for myself. And oftentimes women have willfully done this, and they realize that unselfishly they'll put their children first, but they don't leave any time for them to tend to themselves. How good would it be if more men, you know, stepped up and actually embraced this idea that, you know, I can look and see the pain that you've had to wear for so long. You know, and this is not talking to the men that are around, but to the men that, you know, maybe sometimes look up 5-10 years and they've been out of the children's life. And then they look up and they say, well, it's too late for me to get involved now. 5 years have already gone by. 10 years have already gone by. So it's too late for me to get involved. But it's not too late. You can apologize and you can do better with the next 5 and 10 years to make sure that cycle doesn't repeat. And if we lived in a society to where we not only welcomed men coming back into children's lives, and being able to take some of the burden off of a woman so that she can have some time for herself, we would be in a much better place. But for Hagar, she's bearing this in the wilderness, and so she comes to a part to where she runs out of water, doesn't have any resources, and she places Ishmael under a bush, and she walks away from where she places him. Now, the sad part of this text is the reason she walks away is because she thinks that Ishmael is about to die. And as a mother, she can't brace the idea of seeing him at this place of being close to death, because she feels that she's failed him as a mother. And she hasn't failed him, but she didn't have much to give him in the first place. But she feels that as a mother, she's failed him. And so she places him there and she walks away and she begins to weep. And that's when the angel of the Lord comes to her and asks, why is it that you're crying, and where are you going? Where did you come from? And so she tells him that she is fleeing Sarai. And what's interesting about this is that God stepped in at the very time when she thought that this was the end for her. She's at wit's end where she doesn't know what else to do. She's given all she's had to give. She's even done as much to walk away from where she's physically placed her child because she feels that this time is over. She feels that I failed him and I can't stand to watch the shame in watching this poor child die. And the angel of the Lord comes to her during this time, and there becomes water available to them where they are. And God provides in this time where she thinks that everything is up for him. And what's interesting about this for me is that this goes to show me that in spite of what the situation was, no matter where she went, although this was a plan that she had nothing to do with, that was decided for her that she would be a mother, and in spite of the fact that she had nothing to do with why she was banished, she runs out of resources, and God still finds a way to bless her in a situation that he did not ordain. God's grace is significant in the fact that he still is going to not only make good on the promise he initially made to Abraham and Sarah, but he makes a promise to her. He makes a promise that this promise builds off of the promise when she was pregnant. If we go back a few chapters, when she was pregnant, this wasn't the first time that she left. She left and she fled while she was pregnant. And the angel of the Lord appeared to her then and said that you're going to have a son, and your son is going to be, he's going to have more lineages and generations than you'll be able to count. That promise was made to her in spite of the fact that this was not a plan she came up with. So now, not only is God, his grace, making good on the promise initially of Abraham being a father of many nations through Sarah, through a child that he's going to give, but he's also making good on the promise that he gave to Hagar, that her son would also have many, many generations to follow him. And so as he provides for this child now in the wilderness, and this child it's all because God is a God that keeps his promises. And in chapter 25, this is the part, and we'll close after this, but in chapter 25, this is the culmination of where everything comes together. Chapter 25, verse 9, and it says, then his sons Isaac and Ishmael. I can stop right there, because the text says, then his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Now, what's interesting about this text, and I'll read it at length. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre. This is the field where Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. So this is now at the death of Abraham. Abraham has received his promise of being born a son through Sarah. Sarah has given birth to Isaac. But what this text starts with at verse 9 is then his sons. Isaac and Ishmael are referred to as equals in their birthright as sons. It did not matter that Ishmael came from an Egyptian woman and that she was enslaved to Sarai. all that God saw. And when God saw her, he did not see her ethnicity. He didn't see her nationality and what she represented and her position in society. He didn't see her socioeconomic class. What he saw was a child. And in that child, he saw love, and that promise was made. And through that promise, he made Ishmael a man that had generations that followed. And so in this text, what's significant is the fact that Isaac and Ishmael together, as brothers, as equals, they bury their father. And they bury them in, and just a little bit about that land. Remember at the beginning of Genesis, this land, so I'm sorry, not at the beginning of Genesis, but if you go about 5 or 6 chapters sooner, when Sarah dies, that they die in this land, and Abraham has to find a place to bury her. And so they're in this place, and there's this plot of land. And because of Abraham's status, they offer to give him the land. But Abraham, being a man that he is, Abraham says, no, I will pay you for this land. I don't want to be given any kind of privilege. And I know at the same time, God has blessed me with these fortunes to be able to do this. So I want to pay you for the land. They have an exchange back and forth. And then finally, the man allows Abraham to pay him, and he purchases this land, and he buries Sarah in this land. And so many years later, after Abraham, also we know through the text, he takes many more wives, as the text tells us, and then he comes to his point of death, and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, together, they bury him in the same place where they buried Sarah many years earlier. Now, what's interesting about this is the fact that I mentioned that God saw, in spite of the differences that Hagar had with his wife, God did not see those differences. He didn't see color. He didn't see her as any less of a position. He saw a child and a promise that he made. And so he made good on his promise in spite of the situation that was bad and was less favorable than what he asked them to do. That was contrary to his will. He knew that the child was not the issue. He knew that ultimately it was a mistake that was made because of human flesh. And I'm not going to not bless the child because of a decision the child had nothing to do with. There's no doubt in my mind that many of us, there are things that we have in life and places that God allows us to walk and doors that we've gone through that sometimes have nothing to do with us, but that are tied to our children and the blessings of our children. I have no doubt in my mind that as I look at my life and some of the things that God has done and where I am, that a lot of that is tied to that little boy that we have together, my wife and I. God will bless through children sometimes, in spite of the things that we want to think that we can take credit for, sometimes are blessings because of those children. And so God blesses Ishmael because he saw love. And in spite of that, a child needing love, he made good on his promise. Last thing here, and I'll let you go. If we look at verse number 12 of chapter 25, go a few verses down. Verse 12. Now these are the records of the generations of Ishmael. And then it goes, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave woman, bore to Abraham. Boom. Verse 13 through verse 18 goes through all of the lineages and the generations born that were promised to Hagar through Ishmael. God is a God of his promises, even in spite of when our human flesh gets in the way of his master plan. God's plan was to bless Abraham through Sarah giving him a child that would make him the father of many nations. But Sarah, or Sarai at the time, like many of us, we sometimes look at blessings or we look at promises that we know that we've been made, or when we know that something is, God has called us to something, and yet sometimes the fear of waiting or the fear of it being wrong or not following through or us not being able to see the finish line, sometimes our flesh gets in the way. And sometimes we want to finish the story for God. Sometimes we don't think that God is working fast enough, and so we get in our own way of what it is that God has called us to, or what he's promised us that he's going to bless us with. And in spite of the mistakes that we make, and in spite of the missteps, God still blesses us in those things. His grace still covers us for the mistakes that we make. Sarah was no different than the rest of us when we are waiting on God to do something that we want. And oftentimes we live in a society where we want it right now, but we don't realize that oftentimes the reason we're not getting it right now, maybe it's something that God is shielding us from. Maybe if he gave it to us right now, there's something that's going to take it away or that's going to diminish the value or the glory of what he wants to give us. Maybe he knows that if he gives it to you right now, amen, that sometimes we're going to get in our own way and think that we had something to do with it. And we're going to take the credit for what it is that we have. Oh, well, it was because I finished top of my class. And, I went to the Ivy League school of schools and, and we want to get in the way of what it is that God does. So sometimes God has to take Mr. Ivy League, who graduated top of his class, and not give him that six-figure salary out of the gate that he thought he was going to have based on his Ivy League. Sometimes he's got to make him work for it a little bit and say, well, you know what? Instead of giving you this, the only thing that you're going to have is this $40,000 or $50,000 job. I can tell you a story of somebody I knew in Tallahassee that is now a city commissioner. A lot of people don't know, a lot of people in the area don't know about him, is that, he graduated from an Ivy League school. And after doing so, things did not work out as he thought he would right out of the gate. He didn't have the type of life that one would have thought an Ivy League graduate would have. He had the debt of an Ivy League graduate. And what he found is that for many years, he kind of, he worked on campaigns, and he kind of worked and he assisted others on campaigns. And in spite of all of this, he believed that there was still a plan that he was trusting, that although things had not manifested itself the way that he anticipated, he still continued to persevere. And he became a commissioner after a long amount of time, and things came together for him. But he had to go through a long road of him really getting to a place of where he wanted to be. And oftentimes, we don't know why God keeps things away from us, or those things are delayed. But sometimes it's because of us, but oftentimes it's things he's protecting us from. And so what we have to remember is that through this story, what this shows us is that in spite of a situation that seems less than favorable, sometimes even when situations are less than favorable, or even when we walk outside of the will of God, God's grace still can cover us in all that we do. And that everything that comes out of a situation, the fallout that comes after a situation, that might be on somebody's hands, but God's grace will still bless you anyhow and give it to you even when you don't deserve it. And God's promises don't have expiration dates. If he tells you he's going to do something, God has always made good on that promise. And what he was trying to show Abram and Sarai is that had you trusted me all the way through, you would have seen and you would have known that I'm God in my glory, and that I would have given you exactly what it is that you thought was impossible. And he still did it. Even in spite of them going outside of it, he still did it. But many times we get in our own way of it. And so we got to remember that in spite of that, God's promises don't have expiration dates, and that he can still bless even situations that we mess up. So as we go forward with celebrating the rest of Women's History Month, let us not only remember the accomplishments of women, but also celebrate the women, but also look forward to the progress that has to be made, and realizing that there are situations that are sometimes less than favorable. But in the same way in the text that Hagar said that she called him the God who sees me, God sees us. And when I say he sees us, God knows exactly what it is we're dealing with. And in the nick of time that he needs that we need him, He always steps in. And so I hope that that will bless us and encourage us as we go forward. Let us pray. God, we thank you and we love you for all it is that you are to us, God. We thank you for your grace and your mercy that we don't deserve, God. And we just we thank you for the love and for showing us how to love. We thank you so much for the avenue of being able to come to you, to bring our concerns, to bring our burdens, to bring all of our worries, God, and to lay them at your feet. And we know that although these prayers sometimes might, as we might think, might be delayed, but they're never denied. And so, God, we thank you for being a God of your word and for being a God with with no expiration dates on your promises. God, we love you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.